Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. We are finally back in the studio today. It's been way too long, and if I'm being perfectly honest, it's not that I haven't been sewing and I haven't been filming sewing videos, because I actually have two that just need to be edited and the reveals need to be filmed. They've been ready literally since the beginning of January and the middle of January, but the reveals require me to work with a photographer and to work with a friend who's modeling the dress. So anyways, it's a whole story, but we are back with a new sewing video today. Finally, it has been way too long. I have missed filming and putting out these sewing videos for y'all as much as I love my other videos that are fashion, education focused. Sewing, as you all know, is definitely one of my favorite things, and I know that all of you love it as well. And I am extra excited about today's video because it's a little different than my past sewing videos. So one of the #1 questions that I always get asked in all of my videos is, where can I buy that pattern and how did you make it? Because as you all know, if you have watched my past sewing videos, I create all of my patterns myself using a block pattern, and have no fear, at some point this year I'm going to be filming videos all about how you can draft your own. But today we're using an actual store-bought pattern. So if you want to, you can sew along with me, or after watching this you can go get the pattern and then come back or rewatch it and make it yourself. So today's pattern that we are using is a pattern that I think I have had for over a year. It's just been sitting in my drawer because I haven't really sewn anything with a pattern in a really long time, except for my historical costumes last year. But I was inspired. One of my friends, Laurelei, I will link her TikTok down below. You have to go check her out because she started filming all of these incredible TikTok and sewing videos during quarantine, and I just absolutely love them. So she totally inspired me to pull out this pattern because one of the first dresses she made in quarantine, and she actually started an Etsy shop all centered around this dress and just the perfectly romantical cottagecore vibes of it. And so I have been inspired to try and make one for myself. So the pattern that we are using is this pattern. It is McCall's M7947. Of course, I'll link it down below. But this is the dress. Like most patterns that you buy at the store, it has multiple different style options to choose from, different lengths, ones with sleeves and without sleeves. But we are going to be making one with sleeves. It's going to be a midi length with ruffles and a tie belt, and it's going to be absolutely amazing because we are making it in this gorgeous fabric. It's actually a duvet comforter that I recently thrifted and I'm completely obsessed with, because there's literally enough fabric in here to make like 2 dresses or like multiple other things, and I'm so excited about it, especially because this fabric is a gorgeous toile. I would think that it's pronounced Toile, T-O-I-L-E, because that's how it's spelled, but I googled it and it's actually pronounced toile. It is that vintage print of fabric that has a cream background, and then it has like these nature scenes on it, usually like picnics or different things. This one is like a farm, so of course it's very prairie cottagecore inspired, and I am so excited to use this fabric for the dress. So as you follow along with this video and watch it today, you're going to see me using an actual pattern. And for those of you who are sewers and don't make your own patterns, this will probably make a lot more sense to you and be a lot more inspiring and relatable. So this pattern comes in X small, small, medium, large, and X large. So it's really great because I really hate the patterns that have numbers that you buy, because the size that I always end up sewing never ends up fitting. I feel like small, medium, large fits a wider range of sizes. Plus this is a super loose dress, so it's kind of like one size fits multiple sizes. So anyways, I will be taking a look at this to see what size we are going to make, and I will actually walk you through that process of how to briefly read the pattern and figure out the size that you should make, and then we will get to cutting and sewing and making this fabulous dress. Okay, so let's talk about how to read this pattern. So all patterns on the back always have a chart that allows you to look at your measurements and decide what size of the pattern you should be making. So since this pattern comes in small, X small, small, medium, large, and X large, we know that all of those sizes are associated with a certain size range, and then they also give us how much yardage you need depending on the style you're making, which are the letters, and the width of the fabric you're buying. I'm typically an 8 or a 10 when sewing. Sometimes I'm a 6, but usually I sew more on the 8. So we're going to make this size small. We need 2 1/4 yards. We're using our duvet, and I know the duvet has like 5 yards of fabric. You come down here and it tells you, based on all of your different styles, the finished garment measurements, and then these are all of the different styles that they have. So we are essentially making style C, but we are putting the ruffle with it because, you know, we all need a little bit of ruffles in our life. So then you open it up and you will get out all of your tissue paper pattern pieces and the directions, which are going to tell us which numbers of patterns to cut out. So these are what the directions look like on the inside. If you've never used a pattern before, patterns are great because they literally tell you what all the pattern markings mean, how to essentially read the pattern and use it. They show you what different options there are style-wise to make, what the pattern pieces look like, what they're called, how to lay them out, and then you also get all of the directions on the back side of it, and in addition to all the other pages with written directions and with illustrated images. So I'm not going to go into super detail, but we know that we are making this style C. So we can go over here and find style C, which is right here. It's going to give us the list of all of the pattern numbers that we need, and then it's also going to tell us how to lay out our fabric. I usually don't really follow the layouts because I like to kind of do my own thing and try to save fabric different ways, and we're not working with the typical fabric, but we know that these are all the numbers that we need and this is how we're going to lay them out. Over here the numbers tell us what the different styles are. So since I'm adding a ruffle, I'm also going to grab the ruffle piece to make sure that I add that to my design. So now that we know the style that we're making, we are going to cut out all of our pattern pieces from the tissue paper, which is one of my least favorite parts of pattern making. That's probably why I don't use patterns a lot, because I just hate that process. But once they're cut out, then they're ready for literally every other time you want to use them. So we're going to time lapse that to get through it so we can get to the fun part of cutting it out of our fabric.
When using a store-bought pattern, it's important to make sure and only cut out the pattern pieces for the style you will be using. And this is super easy to do because the directions tell you what numbers of pattern pieces to cut out. And also for this project, since I'm using a duvet as my fabric, I went ahead and just cut off one side or one layer of the duvet to use as my fabric, and I'll set the rest aside for a fun project later on down the road. Next up, it's time to cut out my pattern pieces from my fabric. With the section of the duvet that I cut off, I just folded it in half so that I would create a double layer of my fabric and have a fold. This is important for pinning and cutting out your pattern pieces because many pattern pieces are cut on the fold, and you also have to pay attention to the grain line pattern markings. Because I'm using a print, I also want to pay attention to the directionality of the print so that I don't cut my pattern pieces with the print upside down. So the directions in your pattern always are pretty clear about how you should lay out your pattern pieces, what pattern markings to pay attention to, but you always just want to take your time on this so that you don't make any mistakes. And if you do, that's okay, you can just learn from it. Since store-bought patterns are created with multiple sizes, you want to always make sure that when you're pinning them, you're putting the pins on the size that you'll be cutting out. Some people actually cut their pattern pieces to the size that they are going to be creating, but I like to keep my patterns with the sizes so that I can create different sizes later on down the road. So as you're cutting it out, you always want to pay attention to the different lines that are associated with your style. So for example, for my dress, I'm sewing it and making it on a size small, so I'm only going to cut it to the size small lines. And I'm also going to pay attention to all of the different pattern markings, like the notches that it tells me to cut out. The notches are little arrows that allow me to match my pieces up as I'm sewing them so that they get sewn to the correct sides and so that everything aligns perfectly. One great thing about store-bought patterns is that every pattern piece tells you how many pieces that you should cut out and out of what fabric. So for example, if you're using a lining or an interfacing, it will tell you how many pieces to cut out of interfacing. So for example, with this dress, my straps are going to be interfaced with a fusible interfacing. So not only am I going to cut that out of my fabric, but I'm also going to cut it out of my interfacing.
Okay, so all of my pieces are cut out. This is the front and the back. These are the ruffles, which were part of my design, but I also cut out sleeves because I'm adding sleeves to my design. These are the straps the sleeves connect to. This is my pocket, and then this is a tie belt that I just cut out. That's about like 2.5 inches long. So that's something I just added myself. So we have all of our pattern pieces. Now we're going to start sewing.
Before I start sewing, I always fuse my interfacing to the pieces that need the extra stability, like the pattern tells you. So for example, with this dress, my straps are going to be interfaced, and this is going to give them a little bit more structure. I'm using fusible interfacing here so I don't have to sew it, so the glue side is just fused to the wrong side of the fabric. And the center middle front of my dress, where the buttons are also going to be, is supposed to have interfacing, but you'll see later on down the road how I ended up changing that aspect of this pattern. And also before I started sewing it all together, I went ahead and just finished all the raw edges of my dress before I started sewing it together using my overlock machine, which is a serger, but you can also use other seam finishing methods. Now that all my pattern pieces are cut out, it's time to start the construction process. So since this dress has pockets, that is the first step that we start at, is attaching the pockets to this dress. And the great thing about cutting out the little notches on the sides of my dress and my pockets is that that allows me to perfectly match up where my pockets are supposed to be placed. So we do this by just placing our pockets on the right side of the fabric print of the dress, sewing them on, and then we are going to start sewing the actual front of the dress to the back of the dress, sewing around the pockets to create that little hidden pocket. And this part is super easy, and the directions are pretty straightforward on telling you how to do this, but watching it in real time also helps you to figure it out. At this step in the process, it's always important to make sure that you are always placing your fabric right sides together, which is print to print, and that you're also sewing the correct sides of the dress to the correct back side. So for example, the front left is going to be sewn to the left side of the dress, the front right is going to be sewn to the right side. And this is how we create our side seams on 5/8 of an inch, because this is what our pattern tells us to sew our seam allowance on. And this is also the part that we are also sewing our pockets into our dress since they're already attached. Next, I'm going to sew my straps together by sewing and creating the shoulder seam, and we do this by matching up the notches for the front and the back parts of the strap by sewing together the pieces that have the interfacing and the pieces that are not interfaced, and then those pieces are going to be sandwiched together, right sides together, and sewn along the curve, and then we're going to trim off that excess of that seam allowance and then turn it right side out and press it to create a nice crisp shoulder strap part that will then be sewn onto our dress, and our sleeve is going to be attached to this.
So this sewing video is basically turning into me doing like random vlogs throughout it. But anyways, I thought I'd give an update. It's day 2 working on this. I took a break last night. Got all my winter layers on because the studio is very cold this morning. We got a cold front here in Texas. But I realized that I have to fix something in my dress. So the front of the dress has these kind of like overlay sections where there's supposed to be buttons and buttonholes, and so obviously you're supposed to put interfacing with that, which I did. And then I started thinking about the fact that the interfacing I was using was a little bit stiffer of an interfacing, and it's going to make the front of the dress incredibly stiff, and I really don't want that. I want it to be like loose and flowy. So I think I'm going to recut those pieces and not use interfacing because I don't have lightweight or featherweight interfacing, and I don't want to go to the store. So we're just gonna kind of veer off script and not use interfacing to stabilize it. And I still think it'll be fine with the buttons and the buttonholes on this dress because they're not going to get like a ton of wear because of the dress style. So yeah, we have to fix that, and then it's on to the sleeves and the rest of the dress, which should be super easy.
So I ended up recutting the front part of the dress where the buttons and buttonholes are going to be, and since I didn't have featherweight interfacing, I just decided not to interface it for this, but I also went ahead and pressed it in half so that it would be ready to be sewn on later on in the coming steps. Next, we are going to attach our straps to our dress, and we first do this by pinning it to the front panels of our dress, right sides together, sewing those into place, and then flipping the other unsewn side of the strap to the back top of the dress, pinning it right sides together and sewing those into place so that it creates a strap attaching and connecting our front of our dress to our back of our dress. Then we're going to trim off that excess so that it kind of really doesn't get in the way when we decide to sew down our channels for our elastic and the ruffle of this dress. And I also forgot to put the markings for how far I'm supposed to press this down, so I just took my seam gauge and measured the pattern, which told me to press down the top of my dress 2 inches, and then we're going to fold that raw edge in 1/4 of an inch and add a seam right along that edge to sew it into place. And then we are going to create another seam right above that to create the channel for our elastic. So we're going to do this to both the front and the back. Press it down 2 inches, press the raw edge under 1/4 of an inch, pin that into place, and put our seam right along that edge to hold it down. After the top of our dress is pressed and pinned into place, we're going to take it over to our sewing machine and run a seam right along that edge where we folded it under 1/4 of an inch. There's no specific seam allowance on this, you just want your seam right along the edge of that fabric. After our first seam is sewn into place, we are going to create another seam right above the previous one. I'm pretty sure I measured this at about 1/4 of an inch or 3/4. Basically, I used the left side of my presser foot as my guide to align with the past seam. And sewing this additional seam is going to create a channel that our elastic will be inserted into to create the fitted ruffle at the top of our dress. The pattern also gives you pattern pieces to create your guide for your elastic to make sure you cut it the right length. So I used those off camera, I measured them, cut out my elastic for the front and the back of my dress, and then I just used a safety pin to run it into that channel, making sure to pin the ends so they wouldn't come out of place as I was pulling the elastic through. And then I just basted them into place at the raw edges and the ends so that they wouldn't come out before I went ahead and sewed on my sleeves and my button panels later on.
Okay, so I came into the bathroom to try this on. I always try things on as I'm sewing because honestly when I use store-bought patterns, it's never as accurate as you think it's going to be. So this dress is definitely way more narrow than I was expecting. If I were to make it again, I think I would cut it extra wide so I have a lot more fabric because it's not super flowy. It is very just like straight. So I still am going to add about 1 inch on each side of this because that's where the buttons and buttonholes are going to go. So it will fit pretty well. The one thing I'm having an issue with is that the arms are just super tight, and granted I'm wearing like 3 layers right now, but I think I might go in and cut these armholes a little bit wider because they're just like really cutting into my arms, and they kind of, I don't know, fit weird on the shoulder. But I think I'm gonna go cut those so that they fit better. But other than that, I think it'll be okay. So we shall see. I think if I were to make this again, I might make it as a medium just so that you have more room, even though it is technically a roomy dress. So yeah. So this was the original sleeve that I cut out of the pattern that they gave me. And I measured it around the armhole, and there's no ease whatsoever to even be able to gather this, which you're supposed to. So there's definitely a lot of discrepancies in this pattern that I'm realizing. So we are going to recut the sleeve, but we are going to cut it just extra wide, extra large, so that we have plenty of fabric to gather it up, because there's no way that the sleeve is even remotely going to fit. Even if I cut it at a medium, it still would not fit, which just doesn't make sense to me. So we're gonna recut it, and I think we're just going to cut it like 1 inch wider all the way around and give it like a wider cap at the top so that we have space to gather.
Because the sleeve is going to be gathered, it doesn't really matter how extra wide I cut the sleeve because I can always adjust my gathers to make sure that it fits inside the armhole. And then like I said, my armhole felt a little bit tight, so I also went in with a rotary cutter and just trimmed my armhole about 1 inch wider and deeper along the bottom. And with my serger, I also went in and decided to go and finish off those raw edges of my sleeves before I gathered them and sew them in so that I wouldn't have to do it later on. And I also did the same thing to the armhole of my dress, is I finished the raw edges of my armhole in addition to the raw edges of my sleeves so that I could save that step later on, since I like all of my seams to be nice and finished on the inside of my dress. And I know I say this all the time, it is completely not necessary to finish the raw edges of your fabric, and even if you don't have a serger, you can do this with a zigzag or other seam finishing methods, but I personally like to finish all of my seams just because I feel that it's so much more professional looking on the inside of my garments and it fits a lot better, plus you don't have fraying as it wears throughout the years. Now we're going to sew our sleeves together by creating a seam under the arm, and then we're going to put in our basting stitches just along the top curve of our sleeve. And I went ahead and just did 1 row of basting stitches for the gathers on the sleeve since it isn't super long. Then we insert our sleeve into the armhole of our dress, making sure that right sides are matching up. And I also matched up my underarm seam to my side seam of my dress and the top cap of my sleeve to the top shoulder seam. Once those were all matched up and pinned into place, then I went in and pulled my basting stitches to create the gather at the top of my sleeve, pulling them gently to make sure that my sleeve was turned into the correct size to fit into that armhole, pinning it along the way as I went, and then it was just time to sew it into place. A quick sewing tip for sewing sleeves is that for most of your machines you can actually remove that front storage compartment to just leave the main arm of your machine, and this allows you to actually put your sleeve opening over that arm and easily sew around the sleeve in a circle so that fabric doesn't get all caught. Once our sleeve is inserted, it's time to create the hem and the channel for our elastic. So just like the directions say, we're going to measure the bottom raw edge of our sleeve about 1/4 of an inch using our seam gauge, and then I believe I pressed it up 1 inch or 1.5 inches, whatever the directions told me. And same thing like we did for the top of our dress, we are going to create a seam right along that edge where the raw edge was pressed in 1/4 of an inch, and then we are going to create another seam right below that to create the actual channel for our elastic, making sure to keep an opening. And you'll see all of that happen in a minute once I start sewing it. So seam gauge is definitely going to be your best friend at this step. So once it's pressed into place, we are going to just sew that top edge of our fabric where it was pressed in to just connect it into place, and then we are going to create another seam right below that at about 3/4 of an inch, just using the edge of our presser foot as our guide. And we also want to make sure and keep an opening so that our elastic can be inserted. And now we have a channel sewn into the bottom of our sleeve. The elastic is going to allow our sleeve to fit to our arm, and it's also going to create a little bit of a ruffle on our sleeve as well. Just like the elastic for the top of our dress, our pattern also gives us an elastic guide for how long and wide we should cut our elastic for our sleeves. So using that guide, I cut 2 pieces of elastic and then inserted it into the channel of my sleeve using a safety pin, and then sewed the raw edges together so that they would be inserted, and now our sleeves would basically be complete. The next step in this process is attaching the gathered ruffle to the bottom of the dress. Now off camera I already sewed the bottom ruffle together, and I also went ahead and hemmed it and put in my basting stitch. So here I'm just matching up the side seams of my ruffle to the side seams of my dress, and then pulling my basting stitches to make sure that I evenly disperse those gathers across the bottom of the ruffle. And for this ruffle, since it was a longer piece of fabric, I went ahead and did my typical 2 parallel rows of basting stitches just so that it creates a much more crisp and clean ruffle. Pin that into place, and then we're going to sew that down and then finish the raw edge before we continue on to the next part. Now that our ruffle is sewn into place, we are going to attach the pieces of fabric that are going to have our buttons and our buttonholes. Now most of this I ended up doing off camera, so I'm just going to try to walk you through it as best I can. But basically for this fabric piece, on one edge you are going to fold it in and press it 1/4 of an inch, and then the edge that isn't pressed in, you're going to pin that along the center front raw edge of your dress, making sure to pin those pieces right sides together. And after you sew that into place, you are going to then fold the other section of that fabric over with the edge that has 1/4 of an inch pressed in, and it's basically going to encapsulate it and cover that raw edge to create a new panel of fabric in the front. One side is going to have your buttons and the other side is going to have your buttonholes. So here we have it being sewn into place using 5/8 seam allowance. And then once that's sewn in, the other side is just going to cover it, and then we are going to sew that into place. And the directions explain this a lot better. Once that piece is sewn into place, we are going to press the seam nice and flat, and then we are going to take the edge that was pressed in 1/4 of an inch. We're going to fold it over along the crease that we already had pressed into our fabric, And then we're going to just press it again, and this is going to create that front channel that our buttons and our buttonholes are going to be sewn into, and this is going to happen on both the left and the right side of the dress. So this is extending the front of the dress about an inch in the center and giving us a flat place to attach our buttons and our buttonholes. And I'm just going to put pins along that seam, and I'm going to stitch in the ditch, which basically means on my sewing machine I'm going to create my stitch in my seam right in the past seam so that it's kind of hidden, and also making sure to check that it's catching the fabric on the back. Now the directions in the pattern tell you to actually do this by hand by creating a blind stitch, but I prefer not to sew by hand, so I'm just going to sew it on my machine, even if that means having a barely noticeable seam on the front of my dress. Next, it's time to create our buttonholes. I'm going to use the buttonhole number 50 on my machine, and since my machine is computerized, once I type in the 50 number, all the rest of my settings are going to set up as they should. I'm going to attach my buttonhole foot and also make sure to pull down this arm on my machine, which is going to allow the buttonhole foot to sew the buttonhole itself. You would insert the button at the back of the buttonhole foot, and then the machine kind of registers that, and then it does it actually by itself. So all you have to do is put the buttonhole presser foot down, make sure that the arm is pulled down to hold the buttonhole foot into place, and then you just press your presser foot and it automatically sews your buttonhole. Not all machines are like this. Some machines are actually manual, where you can have to continually pull your fabric to create the size that you want. But on a little bit newer machines that are computerized, once you insert your button, your machine calculates everything and it sews the buttonhole automatically to the size that it should be, which is super helpful, and this is why I love my new machine so much. So this is what the buttons look like once the buttonholes are sewn, and I sewed them according to the markings that were on the pattern pieces. So the next step is just to take a seam ripper and gently insert it into the bottom of the buttonhole and then rip to the top of it. So this might sound super scary, but it's actually super easy, and this is how buttonholes are easily created. And the seam ripper just creates the actual opening inside of the buttonhole that you have sewn. So you have to make sure and be careful not to rip any of the stitches, but usually it's pretty safe to do. After my buttonholes are created, I'm just going to overlap the buttonhole side with the side that the buttons are going to be sewn onto, making sure that everything is even, and then I'm going to take a washable marker and just make markings through the holes of my buttonhole so that I know exactly where I should sew my buttons so that everything lines up and the front of the dress will actually lay flatly and smoothly once your buttons are sewn. So next is to sew on all of your buttons. I sewed this one on camera and then the rest I sewed off camera, but again, buttons are pretty easy to do, and once the buttons are created, this dress is practically done. Now that the buttons are attached, it is time to see the finished dress. So here is the reveal. So I had some fun at turning a corner of my studio into a little bit of a cottage vibe, but here is the finished dress. I absolutely love how it turned out. It's definitely all of the cottagecore vibes. Honestly, it's really giving me like Jane Austen, Pride and Prejudice vibes, which I honestly am all about. I'm so obsessed with this print. It's so fun and so old-fashioned, and as you can see, I went ahead and also made a belt to wear with it, which I just love that the belt kind of accentuates the waist. I love all of the details with the little ruffles on the sleeves and the top of the bodice of the dress and the back of it. And it's just super fun, very comfortable, and obviously very classic and old-fashioned, which is perfect for me. So if you want to try your hand at making this super fun and classic cottagecore inspired dress, I will link the pattern down below, and you can try it out for yourself and rewatch this video to follow the directions of how to make it. And don't forget that if you make it and post it on social media, use my hashtag #MadeWithMaddie so that I can share it and celebrate your creative pursuits in making a dress for yourself. Thank you all so much for watching today's video. Don't forget to hit that thumbs up button if you were inspired by what you saw, and if you aren't already a subscriber, make sure that you subscribe to my channel so you stay updated on new videos and projects in the future. See y'all in the next video.